In late 1920, Gus Chapman was making his second escape attempt up to Atlanta. He was enslaved on the Williams Plantation in rural Jasper County. It seems to be that John Sims Williams was an incredibly wealthy man. He came from generational wealth and he had 2,000 acres of farmland and a near unquestionable control over the county. Well, this was a violation of the anti-peonage laws. Basically, in 1867, the practice of keeping black slaves as peons was abolished. After the Civil War, they wanted to continue practicing slavery, so they would arrest people for violating the black codes, which could amount to something as small as loitering, or standing around, or playing dice in public, or simply existing and looking suspicious. So they would arrest them, and you would pay off your debt over time. Of course, fuzzy math was used. None of the workers ever left any of these plantations, and it seemed to be that the Williams plantation was particularly terrifying. Nobody ever left, and it seemed to be that a lot of people simply went there and were never seen or heard from or even observed working the fields ever again. So the FBI, or rather the Bureau of Investigation, was focused on trying to abolish this system. They knew it was still practiced in the Deep South, but they didn't initially believe Gus Chapman's claims at first. They went out to the plantation, and in February of 1921, they talked to Clyde Manning. It seemed that Williams wasn't there at the time, and Clyde Manning was a black overseer for the plantation. And of course, Manning, who was just as terrified of Williams as anyone else, because he was basically the king of the county, he said, "We're all here voluntarily, it's all cool, it's, we're feeling all fine." But the FBI agents, they noticed that out behind the plantation, there was a slave house with locks on the doors and the windows boarded up. And then, of course, they caught Williams and Manning in a lie about their treatment of Gus Chapman, saying they didn't beat him. Well, they were questioned by the Bureau of Investigation, and, it was obvious that Gus had been beaten savagely. So it seems to be that after this moment, John Sims Williams knew that his empire was falling, so he instructed Clyde Manning, "We've got to use these boys up." And Clyde Manning thought, well, I hope at the bottom of my heart he means release them, but in reality he said we're going to be killing them off one by one. Initial reports seem to suggest that this was all done in one fell swoop, but it seems to be that he would open up his slave quarters and let one or two out, and over the span of a couple of weeks he would kill them. The first one started out with just a man who was killed with an axe to the side of his head and buried on the Williams farm, and then after that you had several guys being asked to dig a ditch where they were killed with a pickaxe, followed by driving them out to a train station, but stopping at the Alcova River and, wrapping them in chains and dumping them off the bridge there. And through this, he managed to kill 11 people, although it's thought that he could have killed dozens. Nobody really knows who was on his plantation, and when they're looking through the records, the folks that were still there, because it's very likely he burned the records after killing them, they had worked there for decades, and they had paid off maybe $1 of their $5 debt, and it's obvious it would never have been released. And John Sims Williams seemed to believe that he would get out scot-free. He could blame his black hand, Clyde Manning, who was only operating under duress and killing these black slaves, and he figured, I'll get off scot-free. Well, Clyde Manning, his testimony was used in part to abolish the peon system because Hugh Dorsey, a man who was the former governor of Georgia and who was heavily wrapped up in the Leo Frank lynching trial, he actually helped facilitate the lynching of Leo Frank, he wanted to repair his image. So he used the testimony of Clyde Manning, and he used local county officials because even though it was a murder case, it could not be tried as a federal case yet because this was the early days of federal policing. They managed to get a guilty conviction. Now, Clyde Manning was found guilty as well, and he was sentenced to life in prison, but Williams was also found guilty and sentenced to life. Now, of course, Williams was killed by a truck that fell over on him a couple of years later, and Manning died a few years previously from tuberculosis, but this was the end of the peonage system down here in the Deep South, and it's said that the Williams plantation was probably underneath this lake, or at least on the shores, and it's very difficult to find information. I can't find his grave, I can't find his old plantation, I can't find where his slaves are buried, and I can't find anything with Clyde Manning, but it's kind of one of those stories in the Deep South that's been very well covered up over the last 100 years. After speaking with the local historic society, I found that John Williams is actually buried in the cemetery here in town. I share a birthday with the man, and the epitaph reads, "May the resurrection find thee on the bosom of thy God." And it's shocking to see that John Williams' son, Clarence Horton, only died in 2017.